Welcome to the Macmillan Report. I'm Marilyn Wilkes, your host, and our guest is Seth Jacobowitz, an assistant professor of East Asian languages and literatures at Yale University. His research focuses on the intersection of media and literature in late 19th century Japan. Today we'll talk with Professor Jacobowitz about his recent book, Writing Technology in Meiji Japan, A Media History of Modern Japanese Literature and Visual Culture, which won the 2017 International Convention of Asia Scholars Book Prize in the Humanities. Welcome, Professor Jacobowitz.
Thank you so much for having me.
So let's begin with your book. Tell us about it.
Well, this is a book that, as I like to say, starts with a hot air balloon ride and ends with a record-scratching cat.
And very interesting.
The book, as you just said very eloquently, is about intersections of literature and media. So really looking not only at technologies, but also techniques of writing and the ways in which they transform language, visual culture, and ultimately literature as well. So the hot air balloon ride refers to a print at the beginning of the book, and then the record-scratching cat is the kind of comical protagonist of I should say narrator of a novel that is called I Am a Cat. And so in the arc that the book tries to elaborate over 10 chapters, it really looks at sort of media history, so the introduction of all of these new technologies that end in graphy, so telegraphy and photography and the like, and the ways that they were instrumental in transforming Japanese modernity.
Okay, and what years are you specifically looking at, from when to when?
So the Meiji Restoration, which is often seen as sort of this watershed event, which is a real, political event, is 1868 and goes until 1912. And my book more or less tracks that period, but it's really beginning a little bit earlier in the 1850s when Commodore Perry and his so-called black ships arrive in Japan and sort of open up the Tokugawa shogunate to trade. Again, I'm not so much interested in the politics of it, but they bring with them a model of the telegraph and a scaled-down version of a locomotive and other forms of technology. Which have a tremendous impression on the Japanese.
Okay, and well, I'd like to get to those actual, the technology in a minute, but I'm curious to know what led you to write the book.
I was very fortunate. When I graduated from college, I had a Fulbright for a year and I went to Japan, and that was really the point where I'd finally reached a level where I could read in Japanese. We were talking a little bit earlier about, with Spanish and other languages, sometimes students start reading the newspaper in their second semester of language study. With Japanese, it takes a much longer period of time.
I can imagine.
And so I was in Japan at Nagoya University. I was finally able to read, better than earlier. And I kept coming across a certain catchphrase when I was looking at sort of the Meiji era literature. And it sounds in English something like, to write things down just as they are. And this was sort of the hallmark of realism. And I found this to be kind of an interesting catchphrase, particularly because I kept encountering it over and over again. And when I started to look at some of these questions of technology, one of the things I found was that shorthand notation, of all things, one of these sort of dead media or forgotten media, also had that same catchphrase, that the shorthand reporter should write things down just as they are. And it was a form of manual recording prior to the advent of mechanical forms of recording. So this precedes the phonograph, it precedes other forms of capturing the voice and the like. Typewriters and things like that are also starting to be invented. So for me, it was a bit of detective work. It was sort of, how do you figure out this puzzle of connecting the dots between the technologies and literature, the aesthetics and the like. And what was most interesting to me is that ultimately there was a very direct correlation. And so that's part of the book. That's sort of the heart of the book.
Okay, interesting. So how did you connect the dots, or how did you do your research?
Well, I was, again, fortunate. I was able to go back to Japan, as many of my own students at Yale are, on a Japan Foundation fellowship. And I was able, by digging into the archives, kind of get elbow deep in the dust and crumbly books, to find the original copies of not only literature, but also transcribed pamphlets of a kind of theatrical storytelling that was very popular. It's still very popular in Japan, but it was sort of the dominant thing in the sort of old downtown entertainment district of Edo, and then later Tokyo. And the shorthand reporters were sort of prohibited from recording some political forms of speech because it was considered to be controversial, and the government was trying to kind of keep a lid on the people's democracy movement and so forth. So they were looking for another outlet to sort of show off their skills. And this form of theatrical storytelling became the occasion for them to sort of show what they could do. And so there it was, sort of in the prefaces of these little pamphlets, the scribbling that almost looks like Arabic, the just very simplified lines and circles and so forth that make up shorthand, alongside, in Japanese, these very interesting prefatory comments that would say things like, shorthand notation, which is a kind of verbal photography, offers a way of capturing speech in these new ways. And in fact, this sort of became the model for a new vernacular language to come into being. It becomes a much longer story, which we don't have time for today, but Japanese in pre-modern times had many different styles of speech and writing.
Okay.
And what we see ultimately with the advent of a new modern literature is something like the vernacular style that is so popular in Western languages and literatures. And that came about through the medium of shorthand.
Okay. So let's look at some of the technologies, and you mentioned, kind of the opening up of Japan through outsiders coming in and some of the things that they brought. So let's talk about some of those things. And how big of an influence was the West on the results that you were able to see?
Yeah,
during this
that's
period?
always the sort of key question. And I think that for a lot of scholars, that's been a question that either, there was either an endorsement of the, Japan was influenced by the West, Japan, reproduced those technologies in its modernization, and then there are sort of others who adopt a kind of anti-colonial or nationalistic perspective and want to kind of resist the notion that Japan simply westernized. I try to thread the needle in a little bit of a different way, and so as I really worked very closely, again, sort of getting elbows deep into the archives, what I discovered is that a lot of the reformers and innovators in Meiji-era Japan were actually in dialogue with some of their Western counterparts.
Okay.
So one of the chapters deals with a fairly obscure figure named Isawa Shuji, who went to Boston to study, and he actually sought out Alexander Graham Bell to teach him another one of these sort of dead media forms called visible speech that Alexander Melville Bell, Graham Bell's father, had created. And Isawa wanted to correct his pronunciation in Japanese, sort of lose his Japanese accent. And the Bells, father and son, were really involved in sort of what we call today like speech therapy, how to help the deaf and stammerers and the like to correct their speech.
I am curious, though, why did he want to lose his accent? To what purpose?
Just to be, I think, understood better.
Okay.
But he was also an educator, and he was an educator also of the deaf and others. Okay. And I think he was really interested in this new form of script that, this was during a period in which there's a lot of reform. Even a generation earlier, people like Benjamin Franklin had talked about adding and subtracting letters from the alphabet. But visible speech was a totally different, invented alphabet. And I think that it really appealed to Isawa in his ideas of how to transform Japanese language education. But at any rate, he learned it directly from Graham Bell. And when Graham Bell invented the telephone, he called Sawa and one of his other Japanese classmates, colleagues, to come over to the house, as the story goes. And apparently Japanese was the second language used on the telephone after English.
Okay.
So there are many such episodes with very high-level contact between the Japanese reformers and their colleagues. The first minister of education from Japan, Mori Arinori, was in dialogue with someone named Whitney, who was, I think, a Sanskritist here at Yale. And a friend of mine, Will Fleming, who's now at Santa Barbara, did some very interesting research on that as well. But in my book, what I talked about was the idea that, so Mori had this crazy idea, or that's how people often talk about it, of replacing the Japanese spoken language with a form of simplified English. And everyone laughed at him and thought he was crazy. But what I discovered is that Mori, not so much in his direct correspondence with Whitney, but looking back to an earlier generation, was looking back to some of those reformers who were saying, for instance, in 1789, that the United States should create its own American English, its own national language on par with its national constitution. So very often in Japanese studies, these type of connections get lost, and I thought it was very important to really reconnect Meiji Japan to its relationships with the West. So that rather than just being a question of copying or resisting, there was a dialogue. And so the book has a lot of these sort of unlikely episodes that I discovered in the process of doing the research.
Okay. And what do you conclude in the book?
What do I conclude? That's a difficult question.
Yeah.
There's a lot of moving parts to this project.
Yes. Well, I'll rephrase that. If you wanted, if you had one thing you'd like your reader to take away from your book, what would it be?
I would say that the technologies that we use, that we speak through, also speak through us. So sometimes people who view media history with skepticism say things like, well, it's a form of technological determinism, that technology is the historical agent for everything. I certainly don't believe that, but I do think that we should be, especially nowadays where we're all so invested in our technologies and communicating through technology. We're being recorded through technology.
Right.
So it's very important for us to have an awareness of that history and the way that technology also has a history, that it has a past.
Right.
And some of these, like I used to joke when I was sort of just starting this project, there's nothing sexier than shorthand. No one cares, right? But there's a value to studying the failures and the dead media and the ones that have been superseded also, because therein lie some of the important half steps on the way to getting to where we are now.
Right. And
so I hope that's the takeaway,
yeah,
ultimately.
And it is important to think about that when I think how many people text now.
That's right.
As a form of communication. They don't speak to one another. Everything is texting. And I am wondering what kind of effect that will have on culture.
Absolutely.
And human beings in general down the road.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many terms that had been forgotten, words like stylus and tablet, that have been revived as our sort of new digital technologies become more prominent and in our lives and so forth. But even a word like emoji, which everyone knows nowadays, made up of these two Japanese words, e for pictures and moji for words. And my book is very much about changing word-image relationships. Even on the front cover, if I can sort of point to it here, we have movable type at the top, one of the innovations brought in the late 19th century, and we have a carved wood block. So we see two forms of media sort of simultaneously in this period of transformation.
Yeah.
And we're also in a period of transformation. Whenever you ride the subway in New York City or in Tokyo or anywhere else, it's just interesting to look around and see how many people are still using paper.
Right.
Most people, myself included, are usually on some form of digital media.
True, true. Very interesting. So this book is out now?
Yes, it is.
Okay, good, good. And you are now off and running on your next project, which is about pre-war Japanese making their way to Brazil.
That's right.
So tell us about that.
The immigration to Brazil started in 1908, so we're still technically in the Meiji period. I go in my book up until 1941, the onset of World War II, which is when the immigration stops, and then it will resume after the war.
Were there many Japanese going to Brazil, and why Brazil?
Right, so the interesting question, why Brazil, is preceded by what happened in this country. It's a very timely question because Japanese immigration was first voluntarily restricted to the United States, and then by the Alien Exclusion Act. By 1908, it was already clear that the Japanese had to find a new destination to send what they called, disparagingly but self-critically, their surplus population. Japan's population really boomed from Meiji onward. So Brazil had this tremendous coffee boom. The land around Sao Paulo state, the interior of Sao Paulo and the surrounding states of Brazil, were ideal for growing coffee. And they didn't have enough labor. There were a lot of immigrants coming from Italy, from Central Europe as well. Japan became another site for labor. So of all of the destinations for Japanese immigrants, Brazil was the largest.
Okay.
There were almost 200,000. I believe the number was about 188,000 that went to Brazil. And today, the largest number of Japanese descendants outside of Japan is not Hawaii, it's not California, it's Brazil.
Have they left any mark on Brazil in terms of, because so many of them were there?
Absolutely. I think, when we look at the legacy of that immigration, I should say I focus on the pre-war literature, which often deals with the hardships of working in coffee plantations and things like that. But in many ways, the Japanese in Brazil also are seen as a kind of model minority. So the grandchildren and great-grandchildren of these descendants of the Japanese are doctors and lawyers and dentists and elected office holders and all kinds of things. It's a very important part of the Japanese diaspora that is, I think, not so well known in this country. But
I agree with that.
So hopefully people will read the next book as well and
learn
something about that.
So we have something to look forward to, so that sounds very fascinating as well. And thank you so much for being here with us today and sharing some of your work.
Thank you for having me. It was my pleasure.
For more information about Professor Jacobowitz and his work, please visit our website at macmillanreport.yale.edu. Be sure to join us again for another episode of the Macmillan Report, made possible through funding from the Whitney and Betty Macmillan Center for International and Area Studies at Yale.